eyes in the sky, gazing far into the night. I raise my hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. It's true, baby, let the light shine through. If you believe it's true, baby, won't you let the light shine through for you.
Welcome to Deception Detection Radio. I'm Kay.
And I'm Chad.
We pray you all had a blessed week. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for bringing us all together. We ask for your blessing upon tonight's broadcast and upon all three of us, that we share your word, Father, that we leave nothing uncovered that you want us to know. Please soften our ears so that we may hear your word, and soften our heart and have your word etched upon it. We ask you, Father, to look over the equipment, make sure that there are no problems with it. Look over our audience, Father, and bless them as they listen. And we pray this, dear Heavenly Father, in Jesus' holy and mighty name. Amen.
Amen.
Tonight we are so happy to welcome to Deception Detection Radio, Nick Redfern. Welcome, Nick.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on the show.
It's great. Thanks for coming on with us.
Yeah, no problem at all.
We know who you are, and we'd be surprised if there's a whole lot of people that don't know who you are. But for those who don't, could you let everyone know a little about you, how you got into this, what you're into?
Well, yeah, sure. I sort of mainly focus on two areas. One, UFOs and related phenomena, and my other big interest is cryptozoology, which is a study of unknown animals like Bigfoot and the Loch Ness Monster and things like that. And I touch on a few conspiracy things now and again, but it's primarily UFOs and cryptozoology. And originally from England, but I live just outside Dallas, Texas, actually in Arlington, Texas. And I've been here about, actually close to 20 years now, something like that. And but I grew up in central England, just outside the city of Birmingham. And my interest in sort of paranormal stuff goes back to my dad. He served in the British Royal Air Force in the military, and he was a radar mechanic. And he was actually involved in several UFO incidents where the radar operators were tracking the high-flying, fast-moving UFOs approaching the English coastline. And this was still when, the Soviet Union was around. And so the first thought was, is it some sort of sneak attack? And pilots were scrambled to try and intercept these things. And they reported seeing these strange balls of light. Others reported seeing sort of classic flying saucer type craft, and this went on for 3 nights, after which everything came to a sudden halt, and everybody, including my dad, was told not to talk about what they'd seen, and he actually didn't tell me until I was about 12 years old. That was actually round about 25 years after the event occurred, and prior to that he'd only ever told my mother. And so that really got me interested, not just because it was my own dad, but also because, he was trained in the military on radar and knew the difference between, an aircraft and something performing all sorts of weird tricks in the sky. And so I began reading books when I was sort of 12, 13 on the subjects of like UFOs, Bigfoot, and a lot of books by people like John Keel and Charles Berlitz and people like that. And then when I finished school, I began working on a music and entertainment magazine, which I did for a couple of years, and I still actually do quite a lot of that writing still today. And it was a magazine called Zero, and I did all the sort of music reviews, and I got to go to concerts and interview bands, and it didn't seem like a real job. It just seemed like fun, being paid to have a good time, And so what I did was to sort of focus on that, and thought when the job finished, well, why not try and combine the background I sort of developed in journalism on the magazine, but combine it with the paranormal and take sort of a journalistic approach to investigating weird stuff. So that's sort of what got me from there to here, so to speak.
It sounds like an interesting journey.
Well, I guess it was really kind of an alternative one, but, I kind of enjoy that. I mean, I enjoy sort of traveling around and, going on expeditions and writing about it, obviously, and lecturing. And when I was sort of 14 or 15, my parents, I actually got a pen friend in France, and they said, well, why don't you go over? So they paid for me to go over, and I got to see Europe when I was sort of 13 or 14, and, it's kind of the best way to do it. You jump in at the deep end, and, you've got to fend for yourself. So, I kind of enjoy that, and I guess that partly had a bearing on me moving over here. I got a job offer and then came over just on a vacation first to see, what the country was like, 'cause I'd never really been before, and, I liked it a lot, and so then as I said, there was a job offer in the coming ahead, so to speak, and so I did the whole immigration thing, which it took about 18 months, something like that, which wasn't bad at all, and then you become legal, etc., and then I was allowed to start working then. So that goes back to 2001. So as I said, we're pushing 20 years almost now. So again, that's sort of what got me here. So.
That's great. Chad?
Okay, Nick, we've spoke previously before and basically wanted to have you on, and I wanted to get into your book, Final Events. And like I said, I've done a review on your book on Amazon, and basically I just said that this is a book that I believe every Christian out there should own, that they definitely need to read this book.
Well, thank you. I mean, that's certainly one of the most controversial ones that I've written because, you gave me your perspective, and then there are people in the UFO subject who kind of look at it all just from an extraterrestrial angle, who take the exact opposite approach. So, in other words, it's sort of polarized people into different camps and different ideas. And for people who don't know what Final Events is about, basically the story goes back to 2007 when I was about to interview a guy named Ray Boucher about his knowledge of England's most famous UFO case, which occurred in a place called Rendlesham Forest in December 1980 when an entire group of airmen stationed at the base saw this strange UFO thing come down. And I was thinking about writing a book on the Rendlesham Forest case at some point, and because I knew that Ray had a lot of material and a lot of it had never been seen before, he generously said, well, yeah, we can have a chat and use whatever you like. But then he said, but there's actually something more interesting than the Rendlesham story that I can tell you if you want to. And he told me how, I thought, well, being sort of taking a journalistic approach, I was like, well, tell me more, And Ray said to me, well, a couple of years ago, actually a few years ago, he said that I interviewed or was met by these two guys working on a Department of Defense program investigating the UFO subject. And I said, well, okay, what makes that different from, the earlier programs that, the government's had looking into UFOs? There have been various ones over the years, like Project Sign, Project Grudge, Project Blue Book, and the Robertson Panel. And basically, they were they weren't debunking programs, but they were, from a skeptical perspective and trying to come up with a down-to-earth explanation for some of these cases. But when I spoke to Ray, he said, well, the group that I met with, that he met, not me, obviously, he said that the group he met, or the representatives of the group that he met, were working on a classified program in the Department of Defense to contact what most people would call aliens, but what within the group were known as non-human entities. And the group had come to a sort of controversial and almost unique conclusion based on all their research. There was probably perhaps 20 or 30 people in this program, and they began by thinking that they were contacting in sort of a mind-to-mind fashion literal aliens, from some other world. The more they dug into it, though, there was sort of bad luck in the program. People fell sick. There were several deaths also in the program, and it was almost as if a cloud of bad luck had descended upon the program. And as a result of this, the group members came to suspect that they weren't actually dealing with aliens. They came to believe that they were dealing with sort of deceptive, demonic entities masquerading as aliens. And so from that point onwards, which is an unclear time, but it goes back decades, Ray met two representatives of the group in 1991. When I looked into it, I was able to sort of push the barriers back decades. They've been really under the radar, so to speak. Most people didn't know about them. And since then, they've been sort of quietly and carefully looking at all the data, even looking through, sort of 15th century old manuscripts on demonic activity and things like that. And as far as I know, they still exist and they're still doing what they're doing. But it's one of these organizations that it's sort of almost in denial, in terms of its existence. And I think possibly because, the fear factor, because a lot of people are, kind of frightened when they, in some respects, when they read the book and the conclusions of this government group that we're sort of at the mercy of these demon entities masquerading as extraterrestrials and manipulating us, which is basically the theme of the book.
Now, there's also an FBI document, I believe 6751, where they actually say, and I'll go ahead and read some of this here, it says, number one, part of the disk carry crews, others are under remote control. Number two, it says their mission is peaceful. The visitors contemplate settling on this plane. And then number three, it says these visitors are human-like but much larger in size. And then number four, it says they are not excarnate Earth people but come from their own world. Number five, it says they do not come from any planet as we use the word, but from an etheric planet which interpenetrates with our own and is not perceptible to us. And number six, it says the bodies of these visitors and the craft also automatically materialize on entering the vibratory rate of our dense matter. Number seven, it says the discs possess a type of radiant energy or a ray which will easily disintegrate any attacking ship. They re-enter the etheric at will and so simply disappear from our vision without trace. And then number eight, it says the region from which they come is not the astral plane but corresponds to the locus or tells. Students of esoteric matters will understand these terms. They probably cannot be reached by radio, but probably can by radar if a signal system can be devised for that apparatus. We give the information and warning and can do no more. Let the newcomers be treated with every kindness. This is an actual FBI document. Have you seen this document that I'm reading?
I'm not actually sure where that one's from. Where did you find that one?
It's on the vaultfbi.gov.
Okay. Yeah. I think that what that is, I think it is a legitimate FBI document, and I think what it is, it was based on the theories of people that had or a group that had contacted the FBI, and back in the late 40s onwards, the FBI did actually have quite a deep interest in the whole issue of flying saucers and UFOs and flying discs, as they were known in a lot of the early FBI files. And they did, the FBI did take a lot of interest and went out and interviewed witnesses and shared their information with the Air Force, who did likewise. There was this sort of, sharing of data between the military and the FBI, which which very often doesn't happen, with agencies. They tend to do their own thing, but, there was this sort of good relationship between the two. And, if you go to the FBI's website, the Vault, vault.gov, there's some really interesting early UFO files available through the Freedom Information Act, and the one you're talking about, it sort of demonstrates some of the early thinking about the nature of the UFO phenomenon, where it actually sort of goes away from like nuts and bolts UFOs and somebody else's equivalent of NASA, and it goes far more down, like you said, like esoteric paths and different sort of levels of reality and dimensions, that go a bit far beyond just, like I said, nuts and bolts UFOs and somebody else's astronauts. So, I mean, you can go back to the early years of ufology, late 40s, and find people who, even back then, were suspecting that we were dealing with something more than just, an extraterrestrial presence.
Yeah, and who was it? Kenneth Grant, who did the Typhonian trilogy, which is funny because it's not a trilogy, it's actually 9 books, but one of the books that he wrote was, and for people out there who are not sure who Kenneth Grant is, he's the gentleman that took over the OTO and the Thelema after Aleister Crowley passed away. And he wrote a book called Aleister Crowley and the Hidden God, and in that book, he actually came right out and said that the entire purpose why NASA was created was to make contact with the other side. Now, that's his word. That's coming out of his mouth. And, the goodness, I'm losing my train of thought here. But, this ties a lot more into the esoteric more than people realize. And that was one of the things that you really got deep into your book, because that was one of the things that the Collins elite really looked into was, why is the UFOs and this alien and all this, why is there an uptick all of a sudden? What's behind this? And they researched and they looked, and it led them to where Area 51 currently is, and that a ritual that was performed out there by somebody from JPL and the creator of Scientology. And also another interesting fact was, who was it? It was Werner von Braun and his mentor, Oberth, who came over under Project Paperclip and took, they were the head honchos out there in NASA. And even they both went on the record and said, look, we've been helped by beings from another world. I mean, this is on record. You can go and find everything that I'm saying. It's all out there.
Yeah, that's true. You mentioned Kenneth Grant, who, was a genuinely interesting character. Like you said, he took over from the OTO from Aleister Crowley. Now, Crowley was one of sort of the most sort of well-known of sort of what some people call like a magician, but not the kind of guy who pulls rabbits out of hats or saws women in half, on stage. Nothing like that. He was sort of dealing with what we call sort of kind of far more ancient and esoteric magic, where involving sort of rites, rituals, occult teachings, and trying to contact supernatural entities and open doorways and portals to allow them in. Now, I always tell people, it's easy to sort of open a door and allow something to come through, but it's not so easy to close that door if the entity or whatever it is doesn't want it closing, And that's why you often find that people who start dabbling in, trying to open portals and channel supernatural entities, they often find themselves sort of getting in over their head. And, disaster sometimes happens, death, bad luck, as I said, illness, all sorts of weird things happen to them. And now, of course, Crowley was someone who, in 1918, performed this extensive ritual, which essentially came to a head when he manifested this entity called Lam, L-A-M. And if you look at Crowley's drawing of Lam online, you'll see it looks pretty much just like what today people call aliens, like the large hairless head and the tiny body and the small shoulders, and this enormous head just bobbing on top. And this was 1918, almost 30 years before the term flying saucer was created, and exactly 100 years ago this year, 1918, we're now in 2018. And Crowley viewed what he contacted, Lamb, as an alien in the sense of being non-human. And that's what you find in a lot of these early magical rites and rituals in, say, for example, you can go back like the 1600s in England with a man named John Dee, who was sort of a 007 type character 400 years ago, but he was also someone who was heavily involved in demonology and things like that, and as was Crowley. And it's interesting that at one point Crowley actually had a home on the shores of Loch Ness called Boleskine House, where again he performed all sorts of magical rituals, and a lot of people who visited the house said that when they went through the front door, it was just like hitting like an atmosphere of like dread and fear, that people just didn't like going there. And so one of the theories is that all of these rituals may actually have sort of inadvertently created what today people call the Loch Ness monsters, that maybe they're not flesh and blood animals, but perhaps they're somehow tied in with Crowley's rituals literally on the shore of the loch. So we have that angle. Then we have a man named Jack Parsons. Jack Parsons was a big follower of Crowley, and in the 1940s, Parsons took over the Pasadena, California lodge, so to speak, of Crowley's organization. Now, not only was Parsons heavily interested in Crowley's work, but Parsons was also one of the very early rocket pioneers in the United States. And he actually has a crater named after him on the surface of the moon. And the U.S. military, when we were fighting the Germans in the Second World War, realized that rocketry was going to be the next big thing. We had aircraft, we had tanks, we had ships. Anytime now we're going to get rockets. And so Parsons, this guy who was like, for all intents and purposes, an occult magician, working with Aleister Crowley, he was actually given a top secret clearance by the U.S. military to work for them on secret rocket programs, and they kind of turned a blind eye to his rituals that he would sort of perform before every rocket flight to try and ensure a safe flight. And eventually he lost his top secret clearance. This was after the war. But he got involved with another well-known character, L. Ron Hubbard, who created Scientology, and before that Dianetics. And he was someone who also performed these rituals with Parsons, also to sort of try and summon up, as they call them, elementals and supernatural entities. So you have this thread that goes from the world of the occult, like Parsons and Crowley, and then you find they're both involved with like espionage and government secrets, classified work. Parsons having a top secret clearance with the military, and Crowley doing work with British intelligence. And then you see how that's really how this blending began of the military and the intelligence community in the US realizing that people were taking this sort of supernatural, ritualistic work very seriously. And then they thought, well, this is where it gets sort of really dark and disturbing. They took the view, could this be somehow weaponized? Could we literally do deals with supernatural entities? And that's where I think, the line was crossed, and you had a lot of sort of sinister stuff going on then.
Yeah, there's a lot that you can really get into in a lot of that area. And I also wanted to ask you, did you ever come across the year 1947? Did you notice a pattern there popping up in a lot of your research?
Oh yeah, a lot of significant things happened in 47. It was actually the year in which Aleister Crowley died. And at the height of it, you had Parsons doing his work to try and open gateways and portals to allow sort of supernatural entities through. And then suddenly, in the summer of 47, we have this sudden appearance of all these flying saucers and these weird craft and creatures suddenly appearing as if out of nowhere. Now, what's interesting is that there's sort of a thread between a lot of the people in the early years of the UFO subject and this whole angle of people like Parsons and also with L. Ron Hubbard. For example, the man who sort of coined the term flying saucer was a pilot named, named Kenneth Arnold. And Kenneth Arnold had an encounter with sort of a squadron of UFOs over Washington State on June 24, 1947. And when he told the press, they said, well, what were they like? What did they fly like? And he said they kind of flew like a saucer would if you skipped it across a lake, bounce along. And that's where the term flying saucer came. Now, Ray Palmer was the editor of a magazine called Amazing Stories, like a sci-fi magazine. And he obviously, when the whole UFO thing kicked off, got really interested in it. And Ray Palmer actually ghost wrote Kenneth Arnold's book called The Coming of the Flying Saucers. He actually ghost wrote Arnold's book. And so they had a connection. And it also turns out that Arnold was friends with L. Ron Hubbard, because L. Ron Hubbard at the time was actually a quite well-respected science fiction writer. So Ray Palmer, having sort of run Amazing Stories, knew him well. And so you had the connection from Arnold to Ray Palmer to L. Ron Hubbard. Then L. Ron Hubbard and Jack Parsons were friends for a while. Then they fell out over a girl. And so all these people in 47, all interlinked. And on top of that, you had, in terms of historic discoveries, there was a discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And it was the year in which the CIA, it was the year in which the CIA was created, and also the year in which the U.S. National Security Act was passed. So you had a lot of interesting things with some sort of interconnected strands and links, all in 47.
Yeah, you nailed quite a few of them there. I'm actually surprised because you hit a lot of the ones that I've actually come across as well. And as well, also, that was also when Israel became a state.
Right.
It was announced in 48, but it had already been agreed upon back in 47. And then on top of that, like you said, the Dead Sea Scrolls, well, what was one of the documents that they found in Cave 1 of Qumran but the Book of Enoch? So that came back onto the scene, and people were starting to, read Book of Enoch again now. I mean, there was an explorer that went to Ethiopia back in the late 1700s that had made 3 copies and brought back with him. And so it was available, but I mean, you really had to go looking really high and low to get a copy of it. But after the Dead Sea Scrolls and Cave 1 of Qumran and the Book of Enoch, then, it became, easily available to get and read, and plus, not to mention, there's also people who say that that's when Parsons and Hubbard performed the ritual out there at Area 51, the Babylon working ritual, where supposedly they opened a rip in space-time and they were unable to close it.
Well, yeah, I mean, regardless of whichever way people look at it, the fact is that the UFO phenomenon really did begin round about the time when Parsons was performing all these rituals. And, that alone sort of gives you a lot of kind of food for thought. And those early years is what the group that I mentioned that Ray Boucher met with in the early 1990s, they had a nickname of the Collins Elite. I'm almost certain that they have like a classified name which has never been revealed. But they use the term the Collins Elite as sort of a nickname, I think, to protect the real name. But the Collins Elite was sort of looking from the 50s onwards into these threads, linking all these people, trying to figure out what was going on, what were these creatures, were they alien, if they were just alien, how is it they could be summoned by magicians, None of that seemed to make sense. It's not like you need magicians to summon up NASA's astronauts. That's just something totally different. So even in the early days, there were suspicions that there was this sort of supernatural and occult aspect to the UFO phenomenon. And that's really where it began, and they just took it further and further, sort of, as I said, reading centuries old or having read, translated for them old manuscripts and books, and clandestinely interviewing priests to get their views, and philosophers and all sorts of demonologists and people who performed exorcisms and things like that, to try and see what the parallels and the similarities were between those phenomena and the UFO phenomenon, and try and figure out what are the crossovers and why are the similarities. Should we be looking away from the UFO angle and far more down a far more esoteric path?
And that's the thing, is that Crowley, back when he was contacting AWAS and Lamb and all them, I mean, he said that, he was trying to basically he was doing demon rituals to basically conjure up and bring forth demons. I mean, that's exactly what he, said that he was actually doing. And another thing just popped in my head that we didn't hit on as far as 1947. That was also the year that they were doing Operation High Jump down in Antarctica with Admiral Byrd, where he supposedly came into contact with craft that was not of this world, or something that the U.S. military plus the other militaries that went down there with the U.S. military, I think it was Australia, England, and a few others, but they encountered these craft that had weapons they'd never seen before. And it wasn't too long after they got down there that they came limping back very quickly.
Well, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's no doubt that sort of that period, 47 and the build-up, 46, when you had Hubbard and Parsons already knowing each other, but certainly 47 to about the early to mid-50s really was kind of like when everything in the UFO subject was really at its peak. I mean, it kind of just suddenly appeared out of nowhere, and the world was changed, and I don't think that's coincidence that it just did come out of nowhere. I think, it was almost like a light was suddenly switched on, and they're already here. It's so a lot of those early days, unfortunately, a lot of people today have either forgot about them or just don't know about them. But that early period was sort of a defining moment, not just for sightings, but for how the phenomenon suddenly developed, and then you had these people suspecting that it was more than just extraterrestrial, really.
I've got a question for you, Nick, and it would be going back 6 years farther than that, to the evening of February 24th and 25th in 1942. A lot of people think that it was just a movie, but it was an actual event, the Battle of L.A. There were bombings, shootings, everything that the military could do at these crafts, and they weren't able to knock them out of the air.
Yeah, that's right. Mm-hmm.
Does that kind of say to you that they were possibly moving between dimensions, and that is why they were not able to be hit by anything that was fired at them?
Well, that's possible. I mean, it is a weird story. For people who don't know, there was this strange set of circumstances which occurred in early 1942 in the United States, actually over California. Now, you have to sort of look at the time frame, because in December 41, there was the terrible attack on Pearl Harbor. Literally thousands were killed when this Japanese sneak attack and the military base at Pearl Harbor, it was just decimated, and ships sunk, and as I said, thousands killed. And it was really that event which brought the United States into the Second World War, which had been going since 1939. But then, it was clear that the Japanese were not going to, this wasn't just going to be a one-off thing, it's going to be repeated again and again, so it had to be stopped. So when into 1942, obviously there was a great deal of panic and worry and war nerves, and so anything in the sky, that was unidentified, people were worried, could this be another Japanese attack? And over the course of several nights in 1942, you had this situation where numerous people in and around Los Angeles and its suburbs saw these strange lit objects flying over the city, sometimes at incredibly slow speeds, like sort of 10, 15 miles an hour, which, aircrafts then, and even today, they cannot fly that slow, for extensive periods of time at all. But that's exactly what they were doing. And because it was clear that they were not American aircraft, they weren't American military aircraft, and checks were made with civilian aircraft, private aircraft, and nothing was going on. So the next step was to try and blast them out of the sky. If they're not ours, then they're hostile. Why else would they be over LA? But you're right that what happened was that despite the fact that you had aircraft in the sky trying to bring them down, you had the guys on the ground with these, cannons, just firing into the sky, etc., and like anti-aircraft guns, etc. Not a single aircraft, or whatever you want to call them, UFO, was shot down. No pieces of them were sort of blown up and, dropped from the skies. For all intents and purposes, it was almost as if, like you actually said, they weren't necessarily physical craft in the sense we understand the term, but they may have been something that was flitting in and out of our reality, or maybe its reality was not sort of like 3D as ours is. Maybe they were sort of more of like a non-physical type thing, or not completely physical in the way we understand that term. But all we can say for sure is that, the elite of the U.S. military in the California area was trying to blast these things out of the sky for hours with not one single bit of success, which would have been impossible, if it had been something like Pearl Harbor. There would have been at least some of them brought down out of the skies and recovered from the oceans or on the land, wherever they fell. But it was like, whatever these things were, they were sort of totally invincible. And to this day, it's never really been resolved. And of course, it's intriguing that it was 5 years before the whole UFO phenomenon actually really began.
The whole thing with the Battle of LA has always fascinated me because it is something that I don't think we're ever going to know the real answer to.
Yeah, that's not the only one. There was also MO41 that took place in Missouri. Then you also had Aurora, Texas, where the aircraft or the UFO crashed into a tower and came down, and they supposedly buried the alien out there in one of the cemeteries. And then after that, like he was saying that, after the uptick, you started seeing stuff like Washington in 1952 where, these craft buzzed the White House numerous times over a 3-day period, and they were literally chased by the Air Force. They sent fighter jets up trying to chase these things, and they would just blink out as soon as they got up there.
Yeah, you're right. And, I think you can say more than anything else, that demonstrates how, whatever they are, how far more in advance they are of us and how they can kind of run rings around us. And, I think although there has been a great deal of secrecy surrounding this, within governments, I still actually wonder if the government is still in the dark. I think they've got a lot of reports and a lot of data. They may even have sort of wreckage, debris, and possibly even bodies. We can never really say one way or the other. But what I would say is they may not have many answers. They might have speculations and ideas, but they may not still know what these things really are.
Nick, was the name LAM, L-A-M, an acronym?
Not as far as I know. No, I don't think so.
I was just curious because I've noticed it's always written in all capital letters.
Yeah, I mean, that's true, actually, it is. I'm not, as far as I'm aware at least, it wasn't, but certainly that was the name that was given to the entity by it to Crowley. It wasn't, he just came up with it. Apparently it was sort of within one of these rituals, that was the name that was given. And of course, I mean, a lot of the stuff is sort of, I won't say hazy, but, it's difficult to decipher at times because, it's like, it's sort of mind-to-mind things, it's sort of contacting these things in an altered state of mind, almost in like a hypnotic state. So in that sense, it's not like trying to commune with aliens on the White House lawn, where they've got a translator device or something like that. This is more like a supernatural exchange of information and data, sort of downloaded into your mind, that kind of thing, which is probably not the easiest thing to deal with when your mind's flooded with material from something that possibly you can't even see until you're in this really altered state,
Right.
And another thing, I keep losing my thoughts. I'm sitting here listening to you guys, and it's like I had something I wanted to go with. Basically, okay, I know exactly where I want to go with this. Now, Project Blue Book has supposedly already been shut down, and Boucher tells you about an organization called the Collins Elite. And now this was an organization that was tasked with getting to the bottom of this whole UFO phenomenon, wanting to know, what's their agenda, why are they here, why all of a sudden there's this big surge. You want to get into that about the Collins Elite?
Well, yeah, I mean, they were one of many groups that over the years have looked into the UFO subject. And I mean, for example, Project Sign, the first group in 47, for a while they really did sort of support the extraterrestrial angle, as did its successor, which was called Project Grudge. Project Blue Book kind of took the view, well, they're not attacking us. There's no sense of hostility. Nobody's being killed. No cities are being bombed. And so the military took it from the perspective as the military would, as they're trained to, which is deal with a hostile force. But they couldn't necessarily find it. They just knew people were seeing things. And so after sort of looking into the subject for a couple of decades and not really finding too much and not even finding, as they saw it, a direct enemy, they dropped it and said, well, this is more for another agency. This isn't what the military does. And so that's why they sort of walked away from it. But it did allow other groups, like the Collins Elite and another one called Operation Often, to sort of look into the more occult, paranormal aspects, which the military didn't feel comfortable in doing because, it's not the military's work, or position to try and, tap into the world of the supernatural. But that's what, the Collins Elite was funded to do. And by all accounts, they actually got a lot of interest from people within government and the military and the intelligence community who shared their views and helped to get the group up and going and funding it and keeping it hidden so that, it wouldn't be found out and things like this. And from there, this went through the 60s, 70s and 80s and, just looking, really just sort of their work reflected what was going on in ufology at the time, new breakthroughs in the subject. The group would then sort of look into that in the same way that UFO researchers would to see what, the latest developments were and what they possibly suggested was going on. And but by the time Ray Boucher was contacted, it all got kind of dark. I mean, I mentioned at the beginning as to how people were, falling sick. Several people died. There was this atmosphere of sort of dread, that they you couldn't put your finger on it, but it was just they were going to the offices or the labs, and things just didn't seem right. And Ray told me how that when he met these guys, at one point, one of the guys took out an envelope from his briefcase and showed him these photographs of 3 people dead in what Ray described as looking slightly like dentist chairs, the sort of big chairs laid back with all sorts of devices by the side of them, etc. And Ray was told that these 3 people had died in secret experiments to try and contact what they call these NHEs, or non-human entities, which, as I said, initially they concluded they were aliens, but then came around to the idea they were demons. But they felt the term demon was sort of too graphic or, pointing in one direction, so they used the term non-human entity. Now, Ray told me from memory that the 3 pictures that he'd seen, one of them showed somebody who had reportedly died of a heart attack. Another one was sort of from unknown sources. And the weirdest one of all was that one of the guys who died in this chair, it was as if, there was like a huge dent in his head. That's the only way I can describe it, like a dent going in a couple of inches, like like an egg, but going inwards, as if something had smashed into his head and just forced it in. But nothing was seen, no entities were seen. And that was the case for the most part, that it was usually they would bring psychics in and who could mind-to-mind contact the NHEs, in ironically the same way that Crowley had sort of 60 years earlier. So it was really, they were like, what goes around comes around, they were doing the same thing. And although they were wary of the work of people like Parsons and Crowley, wary of it because of the danger of it, of getting involved, the big irony is that they couldn't stop themselves, because their goal was, if these are demonic entities and they can kill people at a distance, and they have all sorts of supernatural powers to interact with us in different ways, what about if we try to contact them and do a deal? And which is probably not a good thing to do. If you're dealing with dangerous, hostile, supernatural entities and you try and do a deal with them, that's never going to work out well, And that's what happened, is that the group had this sort of period where everything went wrong. And by all accounts, at some point, the group split, where you had the ones who wanted to continue with trying to literally weaponize supernatural phenomena, and the other side that wanted to kind of get the word out slowly to the public as to what was going on. Now, what happened was that the group that wanted to weaponize it, as far as I know, are still looking into all this, and maybe they have actually, actually have sort of succeeded in perfecting this technology, or what you would call it. But on the other hand, the group that wanted to tell the public kind of, I think, have backed off, as one of the group members told me, because they just didn't know how to tell people without causing mass worldwide panic. That, how do you tell people that we have, sort of demons masquerading in our world and manipulating us, and they're responsible for this and that and something else? They just felt it would be unless there was some huge developments all around the planet, they felt that the best thing to do was to research it quietly, but not tell the public unless they really had to, because, as I said, they felt that it would just cause just worldwide, literal cold fear in everyone,
I know that when I was reading your book and you were talking about the NHEs and the soul collectors, that one actually made the hair on the back of my neck go up. Could you please talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's funny you should say that it had that effect on you, because just about everybody who read the book and who had and commented on the contents all pretty much said the same thing, that it was that story that really kind of frightened them. And so, that may explain why the group didn't decide to go public on a big scale, because everybody who read the book, my book, everybody who read my book freaked out at that. So you imagine that's a few thousand readers. You multiply that by not millions, but by billions of people, then you can understand why they may have been reluctant and at the last minute pulled back. But basically, they had this very alternative theory. And I always tell people that by their own admission, they did admit it was a theory. It wasn't something they could prove. So I always tell people, don't get sort of too, hysterically terrified, because by their own admission, as I said, it was a theory on their part. But they basically concluded that, let me just backtrack and say why they reached this conclusion. If you look into the UFO subject, and particularly that of alien abductions, what you find is there are a lot of cases where, people think it's all about just, the aliens taking like eggs, DNA, cells, etc., as a means to sort of create alien hybrids or whatever. That's sort of the typical general issue that surfaces in relation to abductions in the UFO field. And even for the general public, alien abductions is such a common term that even if you're not interested in the subject, most people know what it means. People are taken away and experimented on. But there are a lot of stories where people have been abducted and they talk about their soul being sort of extracted from the body, and while they're on the UFO, they can kind of see them from above, like an out-of-body experience, that kind of thing. And that really sort of caught the attention of the Collins elite, that this was something that wasn't just some scientists from another world coming here and, taking cells from us in the same way that we might sort of tag an animal out in the jungle, and tag it and follow it and take a few cells, etc., and then let it go. It was not like that as they saw it. They saw things as being very weird and sinister, with, people talking about soul stealers and even feeding on the soul. Some of the people felt weak and tired after the experience and literally felt, like their life force had been drained from them. And the Collins elite's very disturbing conclusion was that these entities had sort of had an awareness that the human soul, whatever, or life force, or whatever you want to call it, depending on your belief systems, whatever you want to call it, the soul life force, they concluded or suspected that it was a supernatural aspect of the body that lives on, but it lives on in the form of an energy rather than a flesh and blood creature or animal or person or whatever. And they concluded that this energy, the aliens, so to speak, or whatever, the NHEs, could literally feed on that high state of energy. In other words, it was in the way we eat food and drink liquid, they feed on the energy of the human soul. And it's kind of like, as I draw an analogy, if you ever seen the Matrix movies, in the Matrix movies, we're all sort of living in this highly sophisticated dream world, like a virtual reality, and we all think, we're going away doing our everyday thing every day, but we're not. We're actually all dreaming. We're all sort of locked down in these sort of huge pods in the future, where billions of people are all sort of having this unified dream together. And the reason it's done is because the machines, as they are in the movie, are sort of feeding on human electricity, the small amount of electricity the human body actually does give off. They're sort of siphoning it and then using it to fuel the machines in the future. And that's kind of what the Collins elite was saying, that the Earth is almost like a factory, that we're being, almost like a farm, we're being bred. They view it from the perspective of us being bred in, like breeding cattle, and then in the same way, that if you eat meat, the cattle goes to the slaughterhouse, etc. And they took the view that when we die, it's a similar thing. They took the view that they take our energy, we're the equivalent of a steak, to them. But like I said, that was their theory based on the notion that people were reporting these soul extractions. And other people, though, there is sort of positive angle to it as well. Other people felt that they were not sort of feeding on the soul. They were trying to understand the human soul, that maybe they don't have souls, that they don't understand what it is that makes us human and what makes us think about spiritual things rather than, not being quite as self-aware, where some animals aren't quite as self-aware as us,
Yeah, the thing, too, was that if Jesus' name was spoken, that they would just disappear. They couldn't stay in that presence.
Well, that's coming off of Joe Jordan's research, who was part of MUFON for, about 10 years. He basically started seeing a pattern in his research and talked to other colleagues as well. And I believe that last I looked into it, he'd uncovered over 400-something cases where when people would cry out in the name of Jesus or call on the name of Jesus, that these entities would flee and the abductions would end immediately. And that's the thing. If these things are traversing, across the galaxy and through the cosmos, why would they flee in the name of Jesus?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's different theories that are being put forward. I mean, if you look at it from that perspective, you can put sort of, look at it from the Christian perspective. A number of researchers have pointed out that no sort of study has been done of, say, 4,000 people who follow Buddhism, to see if anybody in that religion has, sort of called out in their deity's name. We know, tests have been done on people who are Christians in the United States, but it hasn't been done with Buddhists, to that degree, or some other religions. So, I think it's intriguing, the fact that we can keep them at bay. But I think, in terms of the whole angle of, calling out this or that, I think more needs still to be done. Do you see what I mean? It's, in terms of, I'm focusing, I think we should focus on every religion and find, say, 4,000 people in each religion who've had abduction experiences and ask them, if they had that same experience and been able to keep it at bay. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah, I totally understand. But, that's the only one that's been brought to my attention was, like I said, that was through Joe Jordan and his research. And another person I wanted to ask you about, because I know that you since you're so heavily into the UFO research, Dr. Carla Turner. Are you familiar with Dr. Carla Turner and her research?
Yeah, I am. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
She wrote the book Masquerade of Angels, Into the Fringe, Taken, and several other books.
Yeah, she was a very good researcher, and unfortunately she died at a young age of cancer, but she was someone who had alien abduction experiences, and this was sort of 80s, 90s, and when the whole abduction phenomenon was really at its peak. And she was someone who became a big figure in ufology, and as you know, most people in ufology just sort of follow the it's all aliens angle. And she actually really went out on a limb, which was, to her credit, when she was surrounded by all these other people who were saying, no, it's scientists from other worlds or whatever. She actually stood up and said, well, look, I don't know what these things are or where they're from, but there's a major part of this phenomenon which is not just about aliens and spaceships. She noted things like weird synchronicities that would happen to her. She would find weird marks on her body, which some researchers looking into her story made the obvious correlation that, some of these markings on the bodies were not dissimilar to what people describe in sort of demonic possession, and wasn't much difference at all. Just one person says it's a demon, somebody says, no, it's an alien. But, you have triangular marks on the skin, scratches, bite marks. And so, there were people sort of more closed-minded in ufology, and probably those who'd been in the subject since they were in the 20s, and by then they were in the 70s, and it was difficult to get them out of that locked-in, it's all aliens angle, And so I think for that reason, as I said, it's to her credit, and her bravery that she stood up and said, hey, if we're going to actually research this properly, we can't siphon off some of the material because it doesn't fit into this particular scenario of aliens. And, and she did not shy away from telling the more weird, supernatural side of some of the things she encountered,
Yeah, and another thing that you got into, and that's the thing earlier when you were talking about the MK Ultra and a lot of that, the remote viewing and stuff. I mean, you unpack quite a bit in there. And are you familiar with Ingo Swann and his book Penetration, the Question of Extraterrestrial and Human Telepathy? So, what are you familiar enough to talk about some of the experiments he did where he was in one room of a building and drawing the pictures and all that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I know the story general. I actually don't know specific cases of his for the most part, apart from a couple of remote viewing things he did for the government. But what I would say is that, a lot of people like Swan got involved in an aspect of, sort of trying to contact entities, etc., in very much way that the people that were brought on by the Collins elite, they were sort of, in a sense, remote viewers, but they were sort of not focusing on locations or things in the past. They were trying to call on things in other realms. But I think a lot of sort of Ingo Swann's work, you can apply that same angle because you're taking a totally different and successful way of contacting things, which has nothing to do, again, with like landing on the White House lawn, or something straight out of Independence Day. The reality is it's nothing like that, and I think the work of people like Swan demonstrates that you will never contact them, by having that landed on the lawn and they come out down the steps and shake hands. That's just not going to happen because that's not how the phenomenon works, but it's how so many people in ufology want it to work.
Yeah, because he was one of the gentlemen that basically talked about structures on the moon, on the dark side of the moon, and entities like on Saturn and some of these other planets. I found it highly fascinating that, he was able to draw exactly what other people are drawing, like in different parts of a building, that he was in a room all by himself and, that they kept moving the experiment up. Like eventually it got to where, somebody was on the other side of the country and he was in a room and they were drawing something. He was drawing everything that they were drawing identical. And that eventually they moved the experiment to where he was on one side of one continent and somebody was drawing something on a different continent and he was able to match it every single time. But just that, he's talking about these entities and structures on other planets and, it kind of ties in some of, a lot of the stuff with the Vatican. I mean, you got, who was it? Father Malachi, who was the head demonologist. And, he basically went on Art Bell's show and Art Bell was talking to him about Mount Graham. He's like, look, you guys muscled your way up onto that mountain, basically forcing the Indians off the land and built this gigantic observatory. He's like, and he goes, I am going to say that you muscled up on there. I intend to use that word. He said, what are you guys doing up there? And Father Malachi just came right out and said, look, we're basically watching what is approaching the earth.
Well, yeah, I mean, one of the things you do get throughout this story is kind of a thread that the group, the Collins elite, some of the other people associated with them, do have this sort of feeling that things are going to come to a head at one point, where it'll be, where people will have to be told because, it's about to break, whatever it is, So I think, but the problem is they just don't know what to do with it. They don't know how to handle it or to tell people. So they hope that whatever could happen won't happen. But then, you have some people in the Collins elite who sort of took what I call like a eschatological end to all this, like a final days kind of thing where there'll be sort of UFOs in the sky and, paranormal phenomena here, there and everywhere and just things in chaos. Whether that would be, I don't know. We're sort of looking, when you're looking into the future and whatever, but certainly from the Collins elite's perspective, that was one of the reasons that the splinter group did not want to reveal this in case they revealed it, what they thought, and then it never happened. They felt that rather than frighten the entire planet and then have nothing happen, they felt it's best to wait until we see evidence it's starting to happen and then perhaps tell them.
And a couple other items I definitely wanted to see if you wanted to touch on is Valiant Thor and Philip Schneider.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, the story of Valiant Thor is an interesting one because it goes back to the 1950s when a lot of people all across the world were reporting encounters with sort of eerily human-looking aliens. You think of aliens today, anyone from like a kid of 5 years upwards, maybe younger, will say, oh yeah, an alien's got like a big head and black eyes, and they're like 3 or 4 feet tall. Everybody knows that image of the alien. You don't even have to have a remotely 1% interest in the subject, but you know what aliens are supposed to look like. A lot of people don't realize that the UFO phenomenon largely kicked off in 1947, and sightings associated with entities, if you like, didn't really start till about 49, 50. Before then, it really was just the craft. But then, sort of 50 onwards, people started to see what became known as the Space Brothers and Space Sisters. They were described being extremely human-like, slightly taller than us, and having kind of a different quality to their appearance and etc. But in a way you couldn't really understand. But they just kind of seemed a little bit different to us.
They had no fingerprints whatsoever, and supposedly Valiant Thor had no navel.
No, well, I didn't know about that bit actually. So, but yeah, I mean, it's interesting that there are so many people all around the world seeing these very human-like aliens, and they typically would meet people at isolated locations like deserts, forests, mountains, and they would sort of provide the people they chose with these rules, how we need to live. Don't kill people, lay down your atomic weapons or the planet's going to be destroyed. And a lot of these people who were essentially sort of targeted went on to become like authors and lecturers, put on conferences. It was almost as if something had programmed them to suddenly take an interest and go out and spread the word, so to speak, of the Space Brothers and what they wanted for us and how they wanted peace, etc. And through the Freedom of Information Act, we know today that many of the so-called contactees of that era were watched very closely by the intelligence agencies, who were quite concerned about how people were saying that, these aliens want us to change our way of life and, we've all got to be friends together. And one of the most famous ones, George Adamski, he said that the aliens he met, very human-looking, he claimed that they had sort of almost like a communist-type society, which, is not going to go down well in Cold War America in the early 1950s, And so that was one of the reasons why he was watched. But Valiant Thor was one of the more interesting ones because unlike all the other so-called Space Brothers who, for the most part at least, met with people in isolated, deserted locations, he reportedly had infiltrated the Pentagon. And when I say infiltrated, I don't mean from a sinister perspective, but to try and influence the government from the inside. But without the government realizing, in other words, people from other worlds who looked extremely like us, who could pass for us, and subtly, altering our kind of beliefs and lifestyle and everything else. And there are a few pictures of him in a black suit, and he looks pretty much like a regular guy. But and a guy named Frank Stranges wrote a book on all this called Stranger at the Pentagon, which is kind of a mouthful because it's Frank Stranges and the book is Stranger in the Pentagon. It sometimes confuses people. But and Frank Strange's book tells the story of this man, Valiant Thor, who comes to the Earth and tries to, essentially manipulate us from the inside, but to prevent us from killing ourselves. But what's interesting, there are people who claim to have seen Valiant Thor in more recent years and said he doesn't seem to have aged, that he seems to be consistently or constantly sort of 35 or thereabouts. It's, as if it's impossible to figure out his age. So there's a lot of interesting stuff, and there's sort of a subculture that researches the whole Valiant Thor thing and collects, the latest reports and what it all means.
Yeah, back in the 2000, I believe it was somewhere in the 2007 or maybe a little after that, the guy that wrote Stranger at the Pentagon, he basically said that he was still in contact with Valiant Thor, and he said that he hadn't aged one day. He said he still looked exactly like he did back then. And he wasn't the only one who talked about Valiant Thor. There was a guy by the name of Philip Snyder who was on the circuit going around talking about the deep underground military bases and all that. And he actually talked about Valiant Thor as well, that he had met him. And he said he still looks exactly like he does in that photo. And in fact, Philip Snyder's father was in that photo.
Oh, I didn't know that, actually. Huh.
Yeah.
But yeah, Philip Snyder was an interesting guy because he was sort of talking about underground bases and why they were being built and, sort of bizarre experiments that were going under, deep below the U.S. Landscape, where highly advanced boring and tunneling equipment had been used, and there were these gigantic hollowed out areas where, there were claims of aliens or NHEs, whatever you want to term them, under there, sort of in a dark alliance with some aspect of the government and genetic experiments and all sorts of things. And like a lot of people in this field, he kind of died under weird, odd circumstances. And there's a lot of debate to this day, was it suicide? Was it murder? Was it murder made to look like suicide? And a lot of strange stuff. But Phil Schneider's story is, sort of one of the more, really sort of deeply filled with, with sinister stuff and paranoia and just a, very, very odd story.
It sure is. And, I think, again, like I said, if you have not read Final Events, I believe every Christian, or you don't even have to be Christian, I think everybody needs to own this book and they need to read it because you unpack so much in that book. I mean, it's just, I was astonished when I started reading it because, like I said, you took a lot of things that, I'd read in various other books, whether it be esoteric or just, history or whatever. I mean, it's like you put so much into that, like I said, most people, it's going to take them probably a little bit to wrap their heads around some of it.
Well, what I always try and do with my books, which I try to do with Final Events, is I don't like to sort of force a theory on a person, or groups of people. I prefer to share what I found and the theories I've come to and other people have come to, and then put it out there for people to see. I prefer to sort of share the information with people rather than try and indoctrinate them. You know what I mean? I think the responsible way is to get all the information out there, but still allow the person to make their own opinion and their own conclusion on what's going on. I think I do think that's a responsible way to do it because, you find a lot of people in the UFO subject who hold to the alien angle and they will say they know that it's extraterrestrials, or they know it's time travelers, or they know it's this. But at the end of the day, none of us really know for sure, and that's why I like to take that approach, or prefer to take that approach of sharing the information rather than lecturing at your audience. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and that's the thing is I've got quite a few of your books. I've probably got at least 10 or 11 of them. And, I mean, you've written some highly fascinating books like The Pyramids in the Pentagon, and I know you got this newest one that just came out that Kay is totally excited about, the Slender Man. And, I mean, that's the thing is, like, you basically, you tackle quite a bit of, you've done a lot of research into a lot of areas.
Well, I guess that's because a lot of people in ufology are just ufologists. That's just what they do. But for me, you know, I have a lot of different interests. I don't actually consider myself to be a UFO researcher. I would consider myself a paranormal researcher who spends a fair bit of time on UFOs, you know, but it's also a fair bit of time on Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster or the Slender Man or the Men in Black. So, you know, I don't feel pigeonholed into being considered a ufologist or whatever. It's just, that's just a part of what I do. And sometimes you find crossovers between these phenomena, but the problem is a lot of people in ufology, they don't want to deal with these weird paranormal crossovers because I think one angle is that it just freaks them out. And the other angle is that they don't want their kind of comfortable scenario that allows them to be on the lecture circuit all the time, doing this and doing that. They don't want that destabilized by something else. And, you know, that's because it's just a business for them. You know, that's the unfortunate state that some of them have come into, that they go to conferences where they'll say the things that they know the audience want to hear. Well, whether people agree with me or like me or not, I can never really be accused of telling the audience what they want to hear. You know, I tell them what I find, and if they like it, fine. If they don't, that's how it goes. That's tough, you know. But all I can do is provide people with the material I found, rather than do what some certain researchers do, which is tell them what they want to hear, you know. And but that doesn't achieve anything, you know, by doing that approach.
Where can people purchase your books, Nick?
Well, all my books are on Amazon, and probably about 50 or 60% of them you can get off the shelves in Barnes & Noble, and if they don't have them and you want them from Barnes & Noble, they can get them all within about 2 days, 3 days. So.
Oh, I'm right there with Chad. I recommend everyone pick up a copy, and you do cover a lot of topics, and I think that's awesome. Is there a way that people can get in touch with you if they want to write to you?
Website or anything
sure.
like that?
Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, there's several ways. There's several ways. I have a blog called World of Whatever. So if you Google Nick Redfern, World of Whatever, that'll take you to my blog, and the blog has a contact page. People can reach me at Twitter at Nick Redfern UFO, and you can reach me at Facebook. There are sort of 9 or 10 Nick Redferns on Facebook, but if you scroll down, you'll see me with a black bandana and about 7 earrings and piercings. So that's me. I don't think there's another one looks like me, named Nick Redfern at least. So.
I didn't see any others listed there. Like that. So, is there anything that you wanted to say tonight, Nick, that we haven't talked about? Or Chad, were there any questions that you wanted to ask him that we missed?
I mean, we definitely want to have you back on, that's for sure.
Definitely.
But, you know, because we can talk. Yeah.
I was wondering.
I mean, one of the things.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, go on.
No, please, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Well, one of the things I was going to say, you know, you said any sort of last comment, so to speak. What I would say to people, you know, if you have an interest in the paranormal, don't sort of shy away from it. Don't worry about what people think of it. You know, it's regardless of what people think the origins are, these phenomena do exist, and we do need to sort of figure out what they are. And I understand why sometimes people get worried about ridicule and, what's wrong with you, that kind of thing. But at the end of the day, investigating the supernatural is something that actually can have a worthy end to it, in terms of, if we can resolve some of these things and have a better understanding of our reality, then I think, it's important that we do look into these things, and we shouldn't, keep away from them for fear of what your friends or your family are going to say. If there are things to be solved, we should solve them, because otherwise we'll just kind of stagnate. If we hadn't tried to solve things, we wouldn't be doing heart transplants today, or curing cancer. We would just be living to 45 and dropping dead,
That's true. It'd be a lot like the days of the wagons and before that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, if you could stay on the line, please, Nick, when we get done, I would appreciate it. But we'd really like to thank you for coming on with us. It has been such an interesting evening, and we are inviting you back. So that's going to do it for tonight, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in. We pray that you have a blessed week. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Oh, Father, thank you for tonight. We have had such an edifying experience and a learning experience, and we just thank you for the things that you let us see, Father, and for walking with us and for leading this broadcast. We ask that you be with everyone, with Nick, with Chad, with me as we go through this coming week. And please look over our listeners, that you are with them, that you're protecting them, Father, and you're leading them. Let us walk in your ways, Father, and just do your work for you. We thank you for this opportunity, Father, that you have blessed us with. And we thank you in Jesus' holy and mighty name. Amen.
Amen.
In the sky, gazing far into the night, I raise my hand to the fire, but it's no use, 'cause you can't stop it from shining through. It's true, baby, let the light